Stadiums are modern coliseums. Thousands scream for glory, trusting the concrete and steel. But in these massive machines, death hides in plain sight. From a 78-foot fall on live TV to a lethal baseball impact, we analyze 6 tragic moments when the roar of the crowd masked a fatal silence. You will never look at a sports arena the same way again. May 23, 1999. The air inside the Kemper Arena in Kansas City tasted like burnt pyrotechnics and stale beer. Over 16,000 fans packed the massive sports stadium for a live wrestling broadcast. The concrete floors vibrated under the deafening roar of the crowd. Blinding laser lights cut through the heavy smoke. It was an environment built entirely on illusion. But high above the screaming masses, a very real tragedy was quietly taking shape. 34-year-old Owen Hart stood 78 feet above the wrestling ring. He was a highly respected veteran of the sport and a devoted father. Tonight, he was wrestling under a comedic superhero persona. The gimmick required a heavy suit and a restrictive face mask. Hart was a grounded, technical wrestler, not an aerial stuntman. He was openly uncomfortable with heights, yet the script dictated a spectacular, theatrical entrance. He was ordered to rappel down from the stadium ceiling directly into the ring. He waited in the stifling heat of the catwalk, suspended in the dark. The safety system anchoring him to the descent wire relied entirely on one specific piece of hardware. In standard professional rigging, a human life is secured with a locking carabiner. This requires multiple deliberate, twisting movements to open. It is virtually impossible to unlatch by accident. But the independent rigging crew made a fatal logistical choice. Instead of a locking carabiner, they utilized a quick-release snap shackle. This is a specialized nautical clip designed for heavy-duty sailing. Its sole purpose is to instantly release high-tension ropes on a boat during strong winds. It requires only a few pounds of pressure on a small cord to pop open. The riggers chose it so Hart could quickly detach himself upon landing. But a trigger purposely designed to open quickly cannot be trusted with a human life. At exactly 7:53 p.m., the arena lights went completely dark for a promo video. Up in the suffocating shadows of the rafters, Hart shifted his weight. In the tight superhero costume, his movements were clumsy. Perhaps he tried to adjust his heavy cape. Perhaps his thick glove accidentally snagged the small release cord. The exact motion remains lost in the darkness, but the sailing mechanism performed its intended function flawlessly. With a sharp metallic snap, the heavy steel shackles sprang open. All tension vanished instantly. The steel descent wires zipped upward into the pulleys. Hart was suddenly severed from his only lifeline. The 78-foot drop took less than 3 agonizing seconds. In the first second, he plunged straight down through the darkness. The stadium lights suddenly illuminated, catching his rapidly falling silhouette. In the second second, thousands of fans looked up. A collective gasp rippled through the massive crowd. Because wrestling is built on stunts, the audience firmly believed it was part of the show. Many assumed a stunt dummy had been thrown from the roof, but the frantic flailing of his arms betrayed the terrifying reality. He was fully awake. He was acutely aware of the rapidly approaching floor. In the final fraction of a second, his body rotated slightly forward. The human frame cannot withstand terminal velocity impacts against unyielding objects. At over 50 miles per hour, Hart collided violently with the top turnbuckle of the ring. His chest absorbed the absolute entirety of the kinetic energy. The physical impact was catastrophic. The thick steel cables securing the ropes did not yield a single inch. The sudden deceleration caused massive blunt force trauma directly to his torso. His ribcage suffered immediate and severe structural failure. The sudden inward compression of his chest cavity caused a catastrophic injury to the aorta. This devastating injury caused instantaneous and irreversible internal hemorrhaging. He rebounded heavily off the tight ropes and crashed onto the canvas. The referee instantly realized the horror and frantically threw his arms up in the universal X signal for a real emergency. The live broadcast abruptly cut away to the pale, stunned faces of the commentators. Paramedics rushed the ring under the glaring stadium lights. They initiated chest compressions immediately, but the physiological damage was far beyond any medical intervention. His heart had essentially stopped functioning upon the moment of impact. He never regained consciousness and was officially pronounced dead at a nearby trauma center. Inside the Kemper Arena, a surreal nightmare unfolded. In a chilling display of corporate detachment, the organizers refused to cancel the event. The shattered ring was briefly inspected. The canvas was hastily wiped down. Incredibly, the violent athletic matches continued for another 2 full hours. Other performers were forced to wrestle on the exact spot where their colleague had just sustained his fatal injury. The once roaring crowd now sat in a numb, haunted silence. They watched the fake, choreographed violence, fully aware that a sudden death had just occurred. High above them, hidden in the steel girders, the sailing clip remained. It hung uselessly attached to the rigging wire. It dangled completely empty in the hot stadium air. It was a quiet, mechanical witness to a highly preventable tragedy. It was an object perfectly designed to release its burden, operating flawlessly, regardless of the human cost. August 25, 2018. The evening air at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles was warm and smelled like roasted peanuts. Over 40,000 fans packed the massive professional sports arena. The rhythmic hum of the crowd provided a comforting, predictable soundtrack. Baseball is purposely designed to be a leisurely spectator experience. Families talk, eat, and frequently look completely away from the field. Sitting in the elevated loge level was 79-year-old Linda Goldblum. She was a devoted mother and a passionate, lifelong fan of the team. Tonight, her world was perfectly content. She was celebrating her 59th wedding anniversary with her husband, Erwin. They sat side by side, enjoying the summer breeze. They felt entirely secure in their premium seats. But a professional baseball stadium is fundamentally a place where extreme physical forces are unleashed. The illusion of safety in the stands relied entirely on a thin curtain of synthetic netting. In 2018, the protective netting at Dodger Stadium only covered the immediate area directly behind home plate. It stopped abruptly just short of the team dugouts. Linda's seating section was left completely exposed to the open air. Fans sitting in these unprotected areas were expected to pay attention and protect themselves. But the rigid physics of the sport make human reaction times almost entirely useless. A professional pitcher throws a solid ball made of tightly wound yarn and cowhide at over 90 miles per hour. The batter swings a heavy wooden bat with explosive muscular force. When the rounded edge of the bat barely clips the underside of the speeding ball, something highly dangerous occurs. The wooden bat does not absorb the ball's intense forward momentum. Instead, it violently redirects that massive kinetic energy upward and backward. This mechanical deflection creates a foul ball. The projectile acts exactly like a ricocheted bullet. It spins wildly out of control, launching into the spectator areas at terrifying velocities. It was the bottom of the 9th inning. The game was highly tense. A batter stepped firmly into the box. The pitcher delivered a blistering fastball. The batter swung hard. He barely tipped the bottom of the leather ball. A sharp, echoing crack snapped through the stadium. The foul ball launched into the dark night sky. It cleared the top edge of the home plate safety net by mere inches. It entered the open air, arcing directly toward the unprotected loge level. The tightly wound 5-ounce sphere was traveling at exactly 98 miles per hour. That is 158 kilometers per hour. The physical distance from home plate to Linda's seat was traversed in roughly 2 seconds. Time dilated into a lethal, inescapable window. At 79 years old, Linda's natural visual reflexes could not possibly process the incoming threat. She had less than a single second to spot a white blur moving against a chaotic background of blinding stadium lights. She never even raised her hands to protect her face. She did not have the fraction of a second required to simply look away. The heavy baseball struck her squarely in the head. The physical impact was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. A baseball traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour carries enough kinetic energy to shatter solid brick. Her skull absorbed the absolute entirety of the blunt force trauma. The highly localized impact sent a massive shockwave directly into her brain tissue. The sudden transfer of kinetic energy caused a severe, catastrophic neurological injury. She slumped forward silently in her plastic stadium seat. There was no theatrical screaming or dramatic panic. There was only a sudden, horrifying slump and an immediate loss of consciousness. The people sitting directly next to her gasped in absolute shock. The joyous, celebratory atmosphere in Section 47 vanished instantly. Stadium ushers scrambled desperately down the steep concrete steps. Emergency paramedics rushed to her row, navigating the narrow aisles with heavy medical equipment. The game on the field paused briefly, but the vast majority of the fans had absolutely no idea a fatal injury had just occurred in the stands. Linda was loaded onto a rigid backboard and rushed to a local trauma center. Emergency surgeons attempted to medically relieve the immense swelling inside her cranium, but the structural neurological damage was entirely irreversible. She remained completely unresponsive on artificial life support for 3 agonizing days. On August 29th, her exhausted body finally succumbed to the massive head trauma. She was officially pronounced dead by attending physicians. Back at Dodger Stadium, the game had finished days ago. The deadly baseball was likely picked up as a prized souvenir by a completely oblivious fan in a nearby row. But Linda Goldblum's sudden death utterly shattered a century-old illusion of spectator safety. Her tragic end forced a systemic, nationwide reckoning within the sport. Major League Baseball was heavily pressured to fundamentally change its stadium infrastructure. Heavy safety nets were forcefully extended all the way to the foul poles in every single professional baseball stadium across the country. Those extended black mesh barriers now stand as a permanent, silent memorial. They are a physical reminder of a leisurely summer night, a happy anniversary celebration, and a blindingly fast projectile that ended a human life in a mere fraction of a second. March 27, 1978. 73-year-old Karl Wallenda stood 121 feet above the pavement of Hiram Bithorn Stadium in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The tropical sun was blinding. The air smelled of city exhaust. Below him, thousands of spectators filled the professional sports arena. They were not there for a baseball game. They were there to watch a man risk everything. Karl was the legendary patriarch of the world-famous Flying Wallenda's circus dynasty. Most men his age were safely in retirement, but Karl possessed an obsessive need for the wire. He famously believed that life was only lived on the tightrope, and everything else was just waiting. He was fiercely proud and stubbornly refused to perform with a safety net. He also refused to wear any mechanical safety harness. His stage today was a slender steel cable, barely thicker than a human thumb. It stretched tightly between 2 towering concrete structures of the stadium. His only physical tool for survival was a heavy 33-pound fiberglass balancing pole. The physics of tightrope walking are ruthlessly simple. A human body's center of mass must remain perfectly aligned over the thin wire. The heavy, elongated pole lowers the overall center of gravity. It forces the walker's weight down, making the body stable against sudden rotational forces. It is a brilliant system of delicate mathematical balance. But the specific environment inside this open-air stadium introduced a chaotic threat. The towering concrete walls of the arena created a natural wind tunnel. The coastal winds swirling through the massive architecture were highly unpredictable. Karl stepped confidently out onto the vibrating steel wire. The massive stadium crowd held a collective, nervous breath. For the first few minutes, his movements were perfectly steady. His soft leather slippers slid carefully along the braided metal. He reached the absolute center of the stadium gap, suspended over nothing but hard pavement. Then, the invisible trap sprang. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept aggressively between the concrete towers. Meteorologists later estimated this specific gust hit 30 miles per hour. The heavy steel cable immediately began to sway ominously under his feet. Karl recognized the extreme danger instantly. He stopped walking. He instinctively bent his knees deeply. This is the standard emergency procedure for wire walkers. It instantly lowers their center of gravity to stabilize the body. But the coastal gust did not subside. The wind fiercely intensified. The balancing pole, usually his greatest savior, suddenly acted like a massive sail. The aerodynamic force pushed violently against his chest and the long fiberglass rod. Time dilated into a terrifying physical struggle. For several agonizing seconds, the elderly master fought a brutal, losing battle against the wind. His fragile legs shook as the steel cable vibrated wildly beneath his shoes. He could not step forward or safely retreat. The delicate mathematical balance was permanently broken. His center of gravity shifted just a few fatal millimeters past the point of recovery. He lost the physical battle. Karl began to tip sideways into the empty air. The drop from 121 feet takes approximately 3 agonizing seconds. In the first fraction of a second, he dropped his heavy pole. He desperately reached out his empty hands toward the wire above. He tried to catch the steel cable to halt his fall. His fingers grazed the rough metal surface, but they completely failed to secure a grip. In the next 2 seconds, gravity claimed absolute control over his helpless body. His physical frame inverted uncontrollably as he plummeted toward the stadium floor. He was falling entirely headfirst through the warm air. At 73 years old, his body was completely defenseless against the rapidly accelerating descent. He struck the solid concrete pavement of the sports arena at a velocity exceeding 60 miles per hour. The physical impact was instantaneous and absolutely unsurvivable. He suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma directly to his cranium upon immediate contact with the ground. The immense kinetic energy transferred instantly into his skeletal structure. This violent deceleration caused severe immediate structural failure of his skull and cervical spine. His brain sustained massive, irreversible neurological damage in a fraction of a millisecond. His vital cardiac and respiratory functions ceased operating upon the exact moment of physical impact. The deafening silence of the shocked stadium was broken only by the frantic screams of the crowd. Emergency paramedics rushed onto the pavement. Medical intervention was entirely futile. He was officially pronounced dead shortly after arriving at a local trauma center. High above the chaotic medical scene, the thin steel cable continued to vibrate softly in the coastal wind. The heavy balancing pole lay completely intact on the stadium ground nearby. It was a cold mechanical monument to a legendary performer. The stadium, originally built for joyous athletic triumphs, had instead become a tragic final stage. It was the exact spot where a master finally lost his lifelong gamble against the immutable laws of physics. June 16, 2012. The sprawling grounds of Downsview Park in Toronto were temporarily transformed into a massive outdoor professional stadium venue. Over 40,000 excited fans were already lining up at the outer perimeter gates. They were eagerly waiting for the doors to open for the highly anticipated show. Inside the vast venue, the warm afternoon air buzzed with the electric hum of heavy audio equipment. It smelled faintly of hot metal and ozone. At the absolute epicenter of this sprawling entertainment complex stood a colossal, custom-built steel stage. 33-year-old Scott Johnson stood directly in the center of the wooden platform. He was a highly respected veteran drum technician for the globally famous rock band Radiohead. He was a man of meticulous routine. Right now, he was carefully tuning the intricate drum kit. He was completely in his element, preparing the instruments for a night of massive musical triumph. Modern stadium concerts rely on gigantic temporary structures. They must safely support astronomical weights over the heads of the performers. The roof suspended over Scott was a dense grid of heavy aluminum and steel trusses. It held massive LED video screens, heavy automated moving lights, and incredibly large audio speakers. To function safely, this immense overhead weight must be perfectly calculated. The downward force must be evenly distributed through the vertical support columns all the way down to the ground base. But hidden within the mathematics of the stage design, a fatal engineering flaw existed. The roof system was severely overloaded. It was carrying thousands of pounds beyond its actual structural capacity. Furthermore, the specific types of steel truss connections used were fundamentally inadequate for the immense shear force pressing down on them. They were simply the wrong parts for the massive job. The towering metal structure was not a secure, protective canopy. It was an overstressed 6-ton trap resting on buckling metal legs. At exactly 4 p.m., the venue gates were just 1 hour away from opening to the massive crowd. The stadium floor was relatively quiet as the crew conducted their final sound checks. Up in the massive steel ceiling, the relentless laws of physics finally overcame the weakened metal joints. A single sharp crack echoed loudly across the empty arena. It sounded exactly like a massive gunshot. It was the terrifying sound of a primary load-bearing roof truss violently snapping apart under the impossible vertical weight. Time dilated into a horrifying sequence of mechanical dominoes. As the first steel support column collapsed, the entire overhead load instantly shifted to the remaining pillars. These slender supports, already pushed well past their absolute limits, immediately buckled inward. For a single terrifying second, the massive roof simply sagged in the center. Down on the stage deck, Scott looked up from his drum kit. There was absolutely no time to run. The heavy steel grid did not fall in a slow, theatrical descent. It violently imploded straight down. Over 12,000 pounds of jagged steel scaffolding, shattered glass, and heavy electronics plummeted directly toward the floor. The central mass of the collapsing roof struck the drum riser with devastating speed. Scott was caught directly underneath the heaviest concentration of the falling infrastructure. The physical impact was instantaneous and absolutely unsurvivable. His physical frame was violently pinned against the unyielding wooden stage deck by multiple tons of heavy metal grating. The crushing weight caused catastrophic blunt force trauma to his entire torso and cranium. The immense downward pressure instantly compressed his chest cavity. This caused immediate structural failure of his rib cage and vital internal organs. His respiratory system was completely compromised in a fraction of a millisecond. His heart suffered an immediate, irreversible cardiac arrest due to the massive traumatic impact. He never registered the pain. He completely lost consciousness the exact moment the heavy metal structure made contact with his body. A massive cloud of thick gray dust plumed into the warm afternoon air. The deafening crash was suddenly replaced by the frantic shouts of the surviving crew members. They had narrowly escaped the perimeter and were now desperately running toward the twisted wreckage. Emergency sirens quickly pierced the quiet park as paramedics swarmed the jagged metal. But the massive weight of the steel required heavy construction cranes just to safely reach his position beneath the debris. Outside the high venue walls, 40,000 excited fans were suddenly told to turn around and go home. The massive concert space, designed to be an arena of joy, was now an active, silent crime scene. Investigators would soon discover the blatant miscalculations that led to the sudden collapse. In the absolute center of the stadium space, beneath a chaotic mountain of bent steel and shattered glass, Scott's meticulously tuned drum kit lay completely crushed. It was a silent, tragic artifact of a highly preventable engineering disaster. It remained buried deep within a collapsed metal cage that was simply never strong enough to safely stand in the first place. August 26, 2004. The colossal concrete bowl of Cleveland Browns Stadium stood completely silent. The morning air was crisp and smelled of freshly cut Kentucky bluegrass, damp earth, and the sharp chemical tang of heavy machine oil. Without 73,000 screaming football fans filling the orange seats, the massive professional sports arena felt like a deserted, futuristic canyon. 42-year-old John Clayton was walking slowly across the manicured green turf. He was a seasoned, highly respected member of the stadium's groundskeeping crew. It was a standard Thursday morning, and his mind was focused entirely on routine facility maintenance. The grounds team needed to protect the expensive natural grass playing surface from the harsh elements. To cover an entire professional football field, modern stadiums utilize a massive, industrial-grade protective tarp system. This specialized covering is not a simple plastic sheet. It is a tremendously heavy, high-density synthetic fabric designed to withstand torrential rainstorms and snow without tearing. A single section of this tarp weighs thousands of pounds. To deploy or remove it, the human crew absolutely relies on a gigantic motorized roller system. The edge of the heavy tarp is firmly attached to a colossal steel cylinder that rests flat on the sideline. A powerful industrial motor system is connected to the end of this heavy metal drum. When activated, the engine slowly spins the cylinder, winding the thick canvas tightly around it exactly like a giant spool of thread. The automated machine generates an incredible amount of raw mechanical torque. It is purposefully engineered to pull massive amounts of dead weight without straining or slowing down. But this raw power comes with a severe hidden operational flaw. The heavy-duty motor has absolutely no sensory feedback mechanism. It cannot physically distinguish between a harmless fold in the heavy fabric and a living human being. The safety of the entire system relies purely on perfect visual communication between the operator at the controls and the ground crew walking on the grass. John Clayton was standing near the moving edge of the heavy tarp. He was physically guiding the thick material with his hands to ensure it rolled up smoothly without creasing. The industrial motor hummed loudly, vibrating across the quiet field. The giant steel drum was steadily rotating, pulling the vast sheet of fabric toward the sideline with unstoppable force. Then, a single microscopic error in foot placement changed everything. Clayton stepped slightly too close to the moving canvas. The heavy rubber tread of his work boot suddenly became hopelessly tangled in a thick, folding wave of the tough plastic fabric. He immediately tried to violently jerk his leg free, but the material was pulled entirely too tight against his ankle. The giant automated spool did not hesitate. It continued its relentless, mechanical rotation. The immense pulling force instantly dragged his leg out from under him. Clayton lost his physical balance and fell hard onto the surface of the moving tarp. Time dilated into a terrifying realization of helplessness. He was suddenly trapped on a relentless, heavy-duty conveyor belt. The thick fabric forcefully dragged his body directly toward the spinning steel drum. He desperately yelled out for help. He frantically tried to signal the crew, but the machine operator was positioned too far away on the other side of the massive apparatus. The frantic human shouts were completely drowned out by the loud, steady roar of the industrial engine. The physical distance across the massive professional sports arena was simply too vast for an emergency warning to be heard in time. The physical outcome was mathematically inescapable. In a matter of agonizing seconds, Clayton was pulled directly into the spinning mechanical mechanism. His physical frame was forcefully wedged between the heavy layers of the industrial tarp and the solid steel cylinder. The motor simply kept turning, wrapping the thick, heavy canvas tightly around his body, layer by layer. The human anatomy is entirely incapable of withstanding this specific level of mechanical torque. The immense rotational pressure acted exactly like an industrial vice tightening around a fragile object. His torso was violently compressed against the unyielding metal drum. This extreme inward pressure caused immediate and catastrophic blunt force trauma. His ribcage collapsed as the bones suffered immediate structural failure under the extreme compression. The heavy layers of plastic fabric tightly sealed around his chest and neck, instantly compromising his respiratory system. He was physically unable to draw a single breath against the incredible mechanical tension. The crushing, asymmetrical force severely damaged his vital internal organs. He lost consciousness rapidly due to the sudden, severe lack of oxygen to the brain, known as traumatic asphyxia. Within moments, the massive mechanical compression triggered an irreversible cardiac arrest. By the time the distant operator finally realized something was structurally wrong with the roll and abruptly cut the power, the fatal physical damage was already done. Paramedics eventually arrived with emergency sirens blaring through the empty stadium tunnels. But any medical intervention was entirely futile. The crushing injuries were absolutely incompatible with human life. He was officially pronounced dead right there on the sideline. The massive professional arena remained completely silent, bathed in the gentle morning light. The giant motorized spool stood perfectly motionless on the edge of the manicured grass. It was a cold, unfeeling piece of industrial equipment. It had perfectly executed its mechanical function. It had flawlessly rolled up the heavy canvas, completely indifferent to the terrible human cost trapped inside its relentless grip. August 30, 2008. The atmosphere inside the colossal Georgia Dome in Atlanta was vibrating with a chaotic, electric energy. Outside the massive stadium, the late summer air was thick with suffocating humidity and 90-degree heat. But inside the climate-controlled arena, the temperature was a perfectly engineered constant. It was the season opener, the high-stakes Chick-fil-A kickoff game, featuring the Alabama Crimson Tide against the Clemson Tigers. Over 70,000 screaming fans packed the steep seating bowls, creating a deafening wall of sound that physically rattled the concrete floors. Sitting in the crowded stands was 29-year-old William Chris Hayes. He was a passionate sports enthusiast who had traveled to Atlanta specifically for this spectacle. He was fully immersed in the joy of the event, surrounded by the blare of marching bands and the collective adrenaline of the massive crowd. For a fan like Hayes, the stadium was a sanctuary of excitement, a place where the outside world vanished, and the only reality was the illuminated green gridiron below. But a stadium of this magnitude is not just a passive seating bowl, it is a complex living industrial machine. Suspended high above the heads of the unsuspecting spectators was a vast, intricate network of heavy infrastructure. The Georgia Dome's ceiling was a marvel of engineering, a Teflon-coated fiberglass roof supported by a web of steel cables and massive technological arrays. This included a distributed system of giant audio speakers and heavy metal fixtures, each weighing hundreds of pounds. These suspended loads are secured by heavy-duty steel brackets and industrial-grade bolts, designed to withstand the pull of gravity for decades. However, the one variable that is difficult to perfectly model in a static blueprint is the dynamic rhythmic vibration of 70,000 people. The constant low-frequency rumble of the crowd, combined with the thumping bass of the stadium's massive audio system, creates a subtle but relentless physical stress on every mechanical connection in the rafters. High above Section 206, a critical fastening component on a piece of heavy overhead equipment began to silently surrender to the laws of metal fatigue. In the stifling heat of late August, ice was impossible. The culprit was far more insidious: mechanical failure due to relentless vibration and invisible component fatigue. A heavy metal housing had silently loosened over time, vibrating microscopic fractions of an inch with every cheer of the crowd. The object, dense enough to be lethal, hung precariously over the joyous fans. It was held in place by a single compromised connection point, waiting for one final wave of acoustic pressure to break the friction. At a pivotal moment in the game, as the roar of the crowd swelled to a deafening crescendo, the final thread of mechanical resistance gave way. The heavy object, a dense mass of industrial metal, detached completely from its overhead mount. It did not drift down like a leaf, it plummeted. The laws of physics dictate that a falling object accelerates at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. The drop from the high stadium rafters to the seating bowl traversed the vertical distance in only a few terrifying seconds. In the chaotic, noisy environment of a live football game, the sound of the object detaching was completely swallowed by the cheers of the fans. There was no warning siren, no shadow large enough to alert the people below. William Hayes was looking at the field, focused entirely on the players. He had absolutely no reason to look straight up at the dark ceiling. He trusted the building implicitly. He trusted that the massive structure above him was static, secure, and permanent. But the object was rapidly gaining kinetic energy with every foot it fell. By the time it reached the level of the stands, it was traveling with lethal terminal velocity. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. The heavy debris struck Hayes with immense, focused force. The human skull is a miraculous structure, capable of protecting the brain from minor impacts, but it is completely unmatched against the falling weight of industrial equipment. The blunt force trauma was immediate. The kinetic energy of the falling mass was transferred instantly into his body, causing a severe, non-survivable craniocerebral injury. He slumped forward in his seat, his life ending in the span of a single, violent heartbeat, surrounded by thousands of people who were still cheering for a touchdown. The reaction in the immediate vicinity was one of confusion and absolute horror. The celebration in the surrounding rows turned into frantic screams for help as the reality of the accident rippled outward. Stadium medical personnel and police rushed to the section, navigating the narrow, crowded aisles. They attempted to provide emergency aid, but the structural damage caused by the impact was far beyond the scope of any field medical intervention. He was rushed to the nearby Atlanta Medical Center, but the outcome had been determined the millisecond gravity claimed its victim. He was officially pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The tragic irony of the event was suffocating. A man had come to a place of leisure, a fortress of modern entertainment, only to be struck down by a failure of the very infrastructure designed to entertain him. The game on the field continued, with most of the 70,000 fans completely unaware that a fatal structural failure had just occurred in the stands above them. The incident served as a chilling, silent reminder that in a world of massive suspended engineering, the trust we place in the bolts and brackets above our heads is absolute. but the metal itself is not immortal. It was a random, silent strike from the sky that turned a Saturday afternoon celebration into a stark lesson on the fragility of human life beneath the weight of our own creations. Next time you enter an arena, look up at the heavy speakers hanging above your head. Do you trust the rusted bolt holding them? Or will you watch from home? Tell me, is the live experience worth the lethal risk? Debate in the comments. Subscribe now, because survival is never guaranteed.